Okay, I think we can start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rolando Avendaño. I am an economist in the Economic Research and Development Impact Department of ADB. And I am very glad to welcome you to the headquarters of ADB. And we are really glad that you made it in person to this meeting. And we hope to have a very, very interesting discussion today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our chief economist, Albert Pak. Albert is the chief economist and director general of the Economic Research and Regional Development Impact Department of ADB. And he leads ADB's work on producing key analytical work, including the Asian Development Outlook and other flagship publications. Dr. Park has more than 2 decades of experience as a development economist, and he has worked extensively on the People's Republics of China and directed a large number of projects on development impact. So thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours for providing opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I want to really warmly welcome you to this conference on rethinking globalization and fragmentation from regional to global linkages. As chief economist of ADB, I can't think of a more timely and relevant topic for us to be discussing, given the critical importance of economic integration to economic prosperity in the region, and the many current challenges that have arisen in recent years to open trade and investment flows. Economic fragmentation is probably the issue that I get asked the most about when I speak at various forums. And ADB's president, Asakawa, also has been very outspoken in advocating open trade and investment, which of course reflects ADB's longstanding commitment to promoting regional cooperation and integration. I'd like to thank many of our speakers for traveling from different parts of the world to be with us today to share their insights on this important topic. And I think being together in person will enable a much richer set of exchanges during the breaks and meals that can further collaboration and information sharing. As we all know, for many decades, Asia and the Pacific has been a main beneficiary of globalization, including in recent periods during which the region has become an integral part of global value chains, which has helped Asia grow, expand markets, and improve living standards. ADB's Global Integration Index, which will be discussed during this event, confirms that the region's global linkages have strengthened between 2006 and 2021. The drivers of globalization are multidimensional and contextual. We often focus on traditional channels, such as trade and investment, global value chains, and the movement of people. But today, digital transformation and connectivity, as well as coordinated approaches to addressing regional and global public goods, in particular to address climate, environmental, and health challenges, are also emerging as critical aspects of globalization and international cooperation. The extent and nature of globalization can be influenced by geopolitics and perceived conflicts in national interests among countries. The risk of fragmentation has been rising recently, which is affecting the patterns of trade and investment in the region and globally. Although many economists emphasize that no one wins from a trade war, it cannot be overlooked that with prolonged US-China trade tensions, some Asian economies appear to be benefiting from trade and investment diversion. Countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia, attracting investments both from China and the West in strategic sectors and emerging as important manufacturing exporters. Rising risk of global fragmentation are forcing us to ask whether we are indeed entering a new period of economic bipolarization or multipolarization, Will this be a temporary phenomenon or permanent? What will be the impact of recent trends on economies and people's welfare, especially poorer countries and the poor within countries? How should policymakers in the region respond? To answer such questions, we of course need to gain insights informed by evidence. That means, first of all, to develop robust frameworks to measure and track trends in globalization and their economic impact. It also means using the most accurate and timely data available, including perhaps new sources of big data. Today, we have more effective measurement tools and research methods to address these challenging questions, and I'm glad that some of them will be presented and discussed during today's event. Recent studies of the experience of Asia and the Pacific reveal some additional insights into the trends and impact of globalization. First, despite some evidence showing global trade and global fragmentation, slowing global trade and global fragmentation, regional economic integration within Asia and the Pacific has been resilient and by some metrics continues to deepen. Second, as I make a point to emphasize in many international fora, most simulation studies, including studies by IMF, agree that sharp decoupling of FDI and trade into separate US and China spheres hurts smaller countries being asked to choose sides much more than the US or China, which have large domestic markets and diversified trading partners. This is why the US and China should resist forcing smaller countries to fully delink from their rivals, and why other countries should remain committed to open multilateral trade and investment. Third, despite approving the ambitious Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the utilization of this and other agreements to achieve actual economic benefits has not yet lived up to expectations. The region's value chains remain relatively simple, and the potential of intra-regional greenfield investments has not been fully realized. One of ADB's goals is to understand the nature of constraints in order to help member countries build capacity to better take advantage of opportunities provided by RCEP and other agreements. And finally, the rapid digital transformation occurring in many Asian economies is driving increased and deeper cross-border economic activities. The region scores well on measures of technological and digital integration, and digital services trade is emerging as an important catalyst for growth in Asia and the Pacific, growing at an average annual rate of 9.5% between 2005 and 2022. Today, our aim is to discuss the challenges we face and also the opportunities that economic fragmentation might offer to Asia and the Pacific. We hope to assess the changing patterns of global and regional linkages, understand their impacts, and identify policy options that ADB's developing member countries can consider in coping with the risks of further fragmentation. So on behalf of ADB's Economic Research and Development Impact Department, I'd again like to thank everyone for joining this conference, and I very much look forward to today's sessions and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, to set the stage for our discussions today, I would like to ask Mrs. Petia Topalova from the International Monetary Fund to come to the stage. Mrs. Topalova is the chief of the Macroeconomic Development Division of the Research Department at the IMF. Prior to this, she was the mission chief for the Slovak Republic, deputy chief in the Emerging Economies Unit of the European Department at the World Economic Studies in the Research Department. And her expertise and research focuses in the areas of economic development and international trade. We're very glad that you are with us today, and you have the floor. So please, thank you.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Rolando, for the very nice introduction. Thanks so much for having me, and it's truly an honor to be here and contribute to ADB's Rethinking Globalization and Fragmentation conference. And I look forward from the distinguished participants that the Asian Development Bank has gathered from academia, other multilateral institutions, and governments. I wonder whether you can put up my slides. In this session, I will present some of the work that we have been doing at the International Monetary Fund on the issues of globalization and fragmentation. And I will focus on 4 key questions in the next 20 minutes. First, do we see signs of globalization? What does the data say so far? Second, do we see any signs of fragmentation? And here, let me give you the definition of fragmentation, which we view as distinct from deglobalization. We define fragmentation as policy-driven reversal of economic integration, which is often guided by strategic consideration, such as national security or the desire to gain competitive advantage for domestic industry. It does not include reversals to economic integration simply due to autonomous changes. Third, if indeed there is fragmentation, what might be the economic costs that it would incur and through which channels? And finally, what should be the policy priorities at this point? As a multilateral institution whose mission is to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, we pay close attention to global economic ties. While the global economy is at a crossroads, and many wonder whether we are at the cusp of a new phase of deglobalization, so far the aggregate data does not provide much cause for concern. If we look at the ratio of global goods trade to GDP, one can clearly see that the hyperglobalization of the late 80s, 1990s, and early 2010s has given way to a new era of slowbalization. However, there is little indication that globalization is in retreat. Since around the time of the global financial crisis, the ratio of goods trade to GDP has been roughly stable, fluctuating between 41% and 48%. Foreign direct investment, which is not depicted in this chart, however, has become more subdued. Global FDI as a share of GDP has declined from around 3.4% before the global financial crisis to 2.5% thereafter. Yet, if we dig a bit under these aggregate trends, something is definitely happening. We try to gauge the extent of relocation across trade and FDI partners by computing the Lillian index. This is a very commonly used measure of structural change. These charts show that both in the case of trade on the left and FDI on the right, there was a sharp uptick in the extent to which countries are relocating across import and FDI sources. In the case of trade flows, reallocation across import partners accelerated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, after 2018, when US trade tensions with China kind of picked up. For FDI, the uptick is only visible in the last couple of years, basically after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. This uptick in the extent of reallocation is occurring in the backdrop of declining trust across nations. Countries seem to be reevaluating who they trade with and where they invest, paying much closer attention to issues such as economic security and national security. As shown on the right-hand side chart, new trade restrictions, which are compiled by the Global Trade Alert, have increased sharply. There were around 3,000 trade and investment distorting measures which were imposed in 2023, which was about 3 times the number of such measures which were imposed in 2019. At the same time, geopolitical risk has remained elevated since the war in Ukraine began, and the private sector is increasingly concerned about fragmentation. Here in the chart on the left, the blue line shows the number of times executive mentions words related to fragmentation, which has increased very steadily in corporate earnings calls. Uncovering the cracks in the system and the patterns underneath the increase in reallocation that we documented, I'm sure will occupy researchers for years to come as new data on global supply chains, on world input-output matrices, on bilateral trade restrictions and capital flows become available. But we took a first step at this analysis by examining whether the increase in reallocation of trade and investment flows could be related to geopolitical considerations. And we do so by comparing how trade between potential rival geopolitical blocs has evolved compared to trade within such blocs. Why do we take this approach? Well, we analyzed the patterns of trade during the Cold War. This was a historical period of fragmentation, which is quite similar to what we may be on the cusp of today. And what we found is that trade between the rival Western and Eastern bloc was significantly depressed while the Cold War lasted. This is depicted in the red line here, which shows the share of trade between the West and the East, and it fell sharply with the beginning of World War II, and it remained very depressed during the Cold War, and you can see how it rises very sharply once the Cold War ended in 1991. But also note that this was a period where we did not observe deglobalization. If anything, trade within blocs accelerated very rapidly, bringing up the global trade to GDP ratio. So we followed the literature and defined groups of geopolitically aligned countries based on the similarity of the countries' voting patterns in UN General Assembly. So we define a US-leaning bloc, which include countries in the top quartile in terms of their political proximity to the US, a China-leaning bloc, which includes countries in the top quartile in their political proximity to China, and the rest of the countries are considered non-aligned. This is a very common approach in this literature that is growing very vastly. In this chart on the left, we show the difference in trade growth after the war in Ukraine started until the third quarter of 2023, and trade growth for the 5 years prior to that within the two blocs, the first bar, and between the two blocs, the second bar. And the chart shows that trade growth declined everywhere after the war in Ukraine. You know, both bars are negative. But the decline is especially pronounced for trade between the two blocs. Trade between the US-leaning countries and the China-leaning countries during the post-war period was almost 5 percentage points lower than the average trade growth in the 5 years leading up to the war in Ukraine. At the same time, growth in trade within blocs only saw a 2 percentage point drop. This chart is quite telling, but to provide more rigorous evidence, we use the conventional gravity model of trade, which allows us to control for all possible determinants of trade that could be leading to the observed pattern. So in the chart on the right, we depict how much lower trade between the US-leaning bloc and the China-leaning bloc was relative to trade within this bloc for each quarter since 2017. Once we control again for all kinds of bilateral country pair and time-varying determinants of trade. And we see that after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, trade between blocs is about, almost 20% lower than the model predicted values compared to trade within blocs. Now, this whole analysis is about goods trade. Now, let's look at FDI. FDI here is measured as the number of announced new investment projects. This is data compiled by, we should have the source here, by a private company. And we see that very similar to what we saw for goods trade starting in 2022, FDI across blocs significantly lagged FDI within blocs. More generally, IMF research that we did in April 2023 suggests that geopolitical alignment has historically played a very significant role in shaping FDI flows between countries. And this has become a much more important factor over time. The chart on the right reveals that the share of FDI that takes place between countries that are geopolitically close has been rising over time from about 40% between 23 to more than 50% in 2021. So far we have seen some cracks in the flows of goods and foreign direct investment along geopolitical lines. What about trade in services? My colleagues in my division have done a study, and they just finished compiling a database of annual bilateral services trade that allows them to perform the same time of gravity level analysis that I just presented in the case of goods trade. And the results are very interesting. First, on the left-hand side, they replicated the fragmentation across blocks for manufacturing trades, similar to what I already discussed. But on the right-hand side, we have the same analysis for bilateral services flows, and we see that services have remained resilient to fragmentation so far. This is very much in line with Richard Baldwin's claim that the future of globalization is not goods, but services, something that Mr. Parks also alluded in his remark, the rise in digital services in Asia. Now, in terms of fragmentation, in terms of goods trade, how bad could it get? To gauge the potential magnitude of fragmentation along geopolitical lines, we compare the current trade fragmentation with what happened during the Cold War period. And the chart in the slides compared the flow in trade between blocs in the current period, the red lines, and during the Cold War, which are the blue lines. Okay, admittedly, the findings are quite sensitive to how we choose the onset date for the Cold War and currently. But we do see that fragmentation observed thus far is not very different from what was the experience in the initial years of the Cold War. However, one thing to note is how deep fragmentation ended up being during the Cold War, and we hope we certainly don't end in these magnitudes over time. Now, something that Mr. Park also alluded in his remarks is the US-China trade relationship. How much decoupling has already taken place? So let me just take a minute to kind of zoom in on this very, very important relationship. China is clearly losing ground as a source of US imports and a destination of US FDI. As we see in the chart on the left, the share of China in total US goods imports fell from a peak of 21% in 2018 to 13% in 2023. At the same time, there has been a strong increase in the share of imports sourced from other Asian countries and Mexico. The right-hand side chart compares China with other major emerging market destinations of US FDI, such as Mexico, India, United Arab Emirates, and China has moved from being the top destination in 2014 to the last by 2023, as the number of new investments, US investments in China has declined steadily. By contrast, there has been a strong uptick in US investments in Mexico, UAE, in other Asian economies, in India in particular. But does it mean that US is really breaking? So this is again, to depict that many countries are stepping in as sources for US imports, and here to highlight some of the countries that Mr. Park also mentioned, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, India, countries that are really stepping in as China is declining as a source of US imports. But does this mean that US is really breaking trade linkages to China? Let's take the case of EV batteries, one of the products whose import from China was subject to a 25% tariffs starting in 2018. So these are different types of batteries than the one that the Biden administration just imposed tariffs on a couple of weeks ago. We see that there is a sharp decline in the imports of this particular type of battery from China, but this was matched almost 1-for-1 by an increase in imports of this precise HS codes from Vietnam and later from Malaysia. At the same time, if we look at the Chinese exports of these particular EV batteries, we see a very sharp increase in exports of this particular etch code to Vietnam and Malaysia. This is consistent with evidence of rerouting of Chinese goods through other connector countries. And this is not just the case for this particular product that we picked, but it's part of a broader pattern. In this chart, we take the countries that in our exercise before were classified as non-aligned. And we calculate for these countries the change in their market share in US imports over, 2 time periods. And we compute the same for their share in China's exports. And we see that there is a very strong correlation between the extent to which a country has gained market share in US imports and the extent it has gained market share in Chinese exports. I.e., these countries export more to the US, but they're also importing more from China. Similarly, on the right-hand side, we do the same analysis, but we look at FDI inflows from China. So these countries not only import more from China, but they also receive more FDI inflows from China. We're not the first one to document these patterns. There are studies by Laura Alfaro, by Caroline Freund, and other colleagues. And we still have much to learn about what being a connector country means. Is it simply re-exporting? Do these countries actually add value? How does one become a connector? As Mr. Park mentioned, Vietnam is clearly one of these connectors. Large electronics manufacturers have accelerated reallocating production from China to Vietnam, especially since Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. 1/3 of Vietnam's exports go to the US, while China is the biggest supplier of materials for Vietnamese products. But Vietnam is also uniquely placed to benefit from this type of fragmentation and from trade diversion, because it has a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US, while it is also a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a free trade agreement with China. So the correlations that we saw in the data, as well as the anecdotal evidence, are consistent with lengthening supply chains. This is a chart from a recent study by the BIS, which looked at the data from more than 25,000 companies and found that supply chains have lengthened in the last 2 years, especially those involving Chinese suppliers and US customers. So they conclude that trade flows between China and the US are now making additional stops in other countries, and these other countries are often in Asia. So I think so far I have convinced you that while there is no evidence of deglobalization, cracks are emerging in trade of goods and FDI. But should we care about these cracks? Do they entail economic costs? So let me now quickly discuss what might be the economic costs of fragmentation. With trade being the main channel through which fragmentation could reshape the global economy, imposing restrictions on trade would diminish the efficiency gains from specialization. It would limit economies of scale due to the smaller markets, reduce competitive pressures. Trade promotes within industry reallocation, generates productivity gains, but with fragmentation that will be stifled. Less trade would also imply less knowledge diffusion, which is a key benefit of integration. Fragmentation of capital flows of FDI would limit capital accumulation, would limit investment, and affect the efficiency of allocation of capital. And by far, one of the biggest downsides of fragmentation is that it will limit global cooperation right at the time when we face many challenges that require global cooperation, such as mitigating climate change, regulated fast evolving technologies such as AI. At the IMF, as well as many other institutions, have tried to estimate or simulate what would be the economic costs of fragmentation. And the estimates vary quite widely and are very uncertain. But recent work, our simulation suggests that these costs could be very large and they would be weighed disproportionately on developing countries. So in the chart on the left, we kind of depict with a range of economic losses, global economic losses, if global economy were to fragment in two blocks based on UN voting patterns, and the trade between the blocks entirely stops. Global economic estimates are estimated to be around, global economic losses are estimated to be around 2.3% of GDP. But depending on the economy's ability to adjust, the losses could reach as high as 7% of GDP. And as we see the chart on the right, we see that the costs of fragmentation are not equal across countries. They tend to be much larger for lower income and emerging market economies. We also did a study on what happens if we disrupt trade in commodity markets. One thing that we have seen, especially since the war in Ukraine, that the rise in protectionist measures has been much stronger for commodities than for other goods. And our analysis suggests that eliminating trade in commodities between these two hypothetical rival blocks, could be quite large. First, it would lead to very large price swings in, the prices of minerals as some agricultural goods. And the reason for these very large price swings is that, the production of commodities can be very highly concentrated. And also commodities tend to have much lower elasticities of supply and demand in the short run. You can't very, very rapidly scale up production. So for example, take the case of cobalt, where almost 70% of the production of cobalt is concentrated in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's very hard to substitute cobalt in its use in electric vehicle batteries. So if we split the global cobalt market into two blocks, there will be a huge oversupply in one block and significant undersupply in the other. And this would lead to very massive price swings, with prices increasing more than fivefold in one of the blocks and declining in the other. We also found that low-income countries, again, as in the case of overall trade, would be most negatively affected in terms of GDP impact if commodity trade is fragmented, mostly because they rely a lot on agricultural imports, and this raises a lot of concerns about food security. And third, we find that fragmentation of critical minerals markets would make the energy transition more costly. In these illustrative simulations, we disrupt the trade of copper, lithium, cobalt, and nickel between the two blocks. And we find that there's been, that would lead to a massive increase in the cost of some of these minerals because of, again, the mismatch between the supply and demand across the two blocks, which would lead to a global underinvestment in renewable energy and kind of underproduction of electric vehicles by around 25 to 30% relative to what is needed to achieve net zero emissions. But again, turning to something that Mr. Park also alluded in his opening remarks, a lot will depend on how exactly trade and investment fracture. If some economies remain unaligned and continue to engage with all partners, they could benefit from the diversion of trade and investment. So here we present simulations of what would be the GDP losses for countries in the various blocks if the world would fragment in two blocks. So everybody has to align with either China or the US. Or the other case, in blue bars, what is depicted is if some countries, the set of non-aligned economies, which I referred to previously, are allowed to trade with both the US bloc and the China bloc. And we see our simulation suggests that, for some countries, including Asia, which is kind of the last set of bars, they would actually benefit from the trade diversion and from the inflow of FDI that is already happening. So Where do we stand? Let me conclude. So I think, the evidence so far, of course, is not conclusive. We are still very early in the process, but we do see the trade links are being reshaped. Perhaps they're being weakened, though there's not very strong evidence of that. And what should be the policy response? Ideally, we would have a robust rules-based global trading system and a resilient international monetary system, but unfortunately, we are not there yet. So we are advocating for a pragmatic approach to kind of minimize the chances of a runaway fragmentation and try to mitigate the consequences of the fragmentation that is already taking place. So the principle of this is, try to keep lines of communication open and stay engaged. Make countries, try to the extent possible, work together and at least inform each other of the policies that they're taken because of the spillovers that these have and unintended consequences on other countries. For areas of common interest, climate, health, food security, continue to strive for a multilateral approach. But if this approach is not feasible, perhaps it may be practical to work within groups of interest countries while keeping the doors open of others to join. So advocating for a plurilateral approach. In unilateral actions, such as industrial policies, which we have seen a very big increase of, should be limited to address externalities and market distortion and should be time-bound. And for that, we do need, to continue to strive for greater transparency, greater data sharing, and continued policy dialogue. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Petia, for this really insightful presentation. I will now like to ask Albert, and we will have a short open discussion for about 10-15 minutes. Thank you.
We have limited time. If you have questions that you'd like to raise to Petia, please think of them now, but I'm going to start with a couple. One thing when I was watching the presentation, which was very fascinating, was this decline in the relative between block trade and investment. And given the timing, have you tried to distinguish how much of that is due to sanctions against Russia and how much is due to just intensifying US-China trade tensions?
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Yes, that's a very good question and something we plan to look at. Certainly, it's not all due to the China-US trade tensions, because presumably, if that was a driving force, we would have seen it starting in 2018 when the first round of tariffs was imposed. And Russia, the sanctions certainly play a very big role. For example, I was recently presenting, discussing to, a set of policymakers from the Caucasus, and they were exactly saying how, with the sanctions, they have actually become connectors for trade, between Russia and Europe. And they're seeing a massive boom and massive amount of trade diversion and FDI, similar to what, Asian economies are experiencing in the case of China and US trade relations. But we have not precisely quantified to what extent this is between bloc fragmentation is entirely due to sanctions or there are other factors. But this is something that we are planning to look at. The WTO has a very similar and related exercise that they do with slightly different data, and they have done this robustness analysis, and in their study, the results, about lower trade between blocs is quite robust to excluding all trade that involves Russia, suggesting that it's not just the sanctions driving this.
And the other question I had first, we were talking before that, IMS has been kind of leading and kind of being systematic of looking at the effects of fragmentation on trade, FDI, commodity prices. And I'm curious, what is the future research agenda on fragmentation at IMF? What do you think are the important questions now? And in particular, at the end of your talk, you mentioned industrial policies, which seem obviously to interact in important ways with trade barriers. And so I'm curious, where is IMF going in terms of its research?
So you're right that we had a first kind of generation of research on fragmentation, which mostly looked at kind of documenting, conceptually, what are the channels through which such fragmentation would impact economic activity, in a set of paper that really relied on simulations of what the economic costs would be, whether it be fragmentation in FDI flows, in trade flows, in commodities, and so on. What we are currently looking into is precisely, trying to, instead of just relying on simulations, in which you have to make some, often ad hoc assumptions about how much trade barriers would rise, what would be the composition of these blocks, who is aligning with whom. We are really trying to build our capacity in terms of data collection, both on the side of, flows, high frequency flows, not only trade, but also, FDI, as I said, services, trade, but also on the policy measures. So talking about industrial policies, we have a team at the fund who is trying to compile a database of industrial policies. It's similar to what the Global Trade Alert is doing, but really focusing on industrial policy and trying to, instead of having simulation, try to have empirical estimates of what the impact of these industrial policies have been. So we're really working now on, using the actual data of the policy measures and linking these measures to the effects that they may have, including spillovers to other countries. And a recent line of work is, again, looking a little bit more into the electric vehicles market, given the recent measures that were imposed by the US. So we are following that pretty closely, given how globally integrated this sector is.
Great, thanks. So maybe I can open up. Are there any questions from the floor? John.
So thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I have two questions. First one of my question is that it's quite important to recognize the resilience of trade and services compared to trade and goods. But in the case of trade and goods, most of the Asian countries have been net exporter, which has been the important source of the so-called global imbalance, as touted by the Financial Times and Martineau for such a long time. When it comes to trade and services, most of the Asian countries are net importers. So while the global level, overall, the trade and services could be resilient, but under the hood, many Asian countries might be still suffering from the lack of competitiveness in the service sector and still continue to import a lot of services from US and other advanced economies. That's one point I'd like to ask for your feedback on this issue. Another question of mine is that the important role of the non-alignment countries, which who can play some connectivity role between the two blocks, between the US and the China-led groups. But at the same time, we also see some type of the challenges from the policy angle. For example, in the context of the upcoming review of the USMCA scheduled in 2026, many of the congressmen in the US are saying that we need to review the potential transshipment of the Chinese investment through Mexico, for example, in the context of the review of that USMCA. Also, in the context of anti-dumping duties imposed by the US government, some of the occasions through which we have seen that some of the anti-dumping duties also imposed on the transshipment coming through the Vietnam, beyond the import coming from directly from the China. So from the policy angle, we also see some challenges in encouraging and advocating some positive role to be played by non-alignment group of countries. So I would like to ask for your feedback on this issue as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you. These are all great questions. On services trade, this is really, we just uncovered this a couple of weeks ago. So we are starting to explore, much more this data and to see, whether there are certain, cracks in the system, as you said, for Asian economies. Except, of course, India. India is one of the biggest services exports. So we actually were inspired to look into that because our chief economist is precisely giving a talk in India on fragmentation, and we were saying, well, at least there is a silver lining for India because trade in services is very resilient, so far. But yeah, this is something that we hope to take a closer look at. In terms of the transshipment and to what extent the status of connector countries, will be allowed to happen by the US, because what we are seeing is if, their stated objective of the stated objective of the policies that the US is imposing is to kind of ensure resilience and independence, from China. This is certainly not being achieved with the existence of this connector country. So we basically need to see to what extent, they're serious about it and they want to enforce it going forward. But I imagine it's a very tough position to be in the private sector right now and to try to decide, given this huge uncertainty about future trade policy, whether to relocate production, whether to just transship, what, how to ensure market access to, other places. Yeah, thank you.
Just as a follow-up to that, it strikes me that if the U.S. really blocks off transshipment, I mean, there's real processing going on too, so it's not completely evasion, perhaps. But if they did that, it's going to be hugely costly to U.S. consumers and producers, obviously, when the real low-cost technologies for manufacturing are connected to China, either from China or through supply chains linked to China. And I'm also wondering, I mean, if the U.S. were to go that way, and it looks like they will, at least for key goods, whether their allies would follow. Like, you could imagine many European countries being unwilling to accept those costs. So you could see different types of differences, even within blocks, so to speak, taking it to that extent, given the high cost you're really imposing on yourself. Maybe more a comment than a question. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, I think we're at, oh yeah, sorry, right here.
Good morning. I'm Lina Kia from the Department of Trade and Industry. Thank you for your presentations and remarks. I wanted to ask, on supply chain, we've seen many countries forming partnerships and agreements on supply chain and supply chain resilience, such as on IPEF, the supply chain agreement, which was recently signed, and also on critical minerals between US and Japan, and also some of the European countries with the African countries. What are your views on this, and what do you think their effects will be in terms of the observed changes? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I guess this is, countries' policies to try to, ensure resilience in their supply chains, and, especially for, things that they consider critical. Now with the green transition, there's, this is very resource intensive. It is very intensive in certain commodities, which, as I mentioned, whose production can be very highly concentrated in certain economies. So I think, it's understandable that countries are trying to ensure access to these supplies because, in case, the country goes to another block, the implications could be very devastating. To the extent that these are not kind of discriminatory and remain open to other economies to join, I would think that we will be supportive of this partnership. This is the so-called plurilateral approach, that may be a second best in the absence of, multilateral progress. But again, a key thing that we argue for is that they should remain open and not exclusive to the countries that first signed them. So to the extent that additional countries agree to the principles that are laid out in these agreements, they should be allowed to join.
Okay, one last question in the front, and I think we need to get on to the next session.
I'm Liu Chintong, the Deputy Investment, Trade and Industry Minister from Malaysia. Just a brief comment. We are seeing all this presupposed that the United States and to a lesser extent Europe will continue to be the consumer of the last resort of export-led economies or products from export-led economies in Asia. But with US having a diminishing or shrinking middle class, how long can this outsourcing model work in this particular loop as it has been over the last 50 years? And I think that may be something that we might have to rethink, given that also because China's capacity and Asia in general, in terms of technological acquisition and gains, has really been at a high pace. Can US and Europe continue to take the capacity of China and Asia? I have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. I mean, the simulations that, this is kind of the weakness of the analysis in some sense is that we take the world as is right now, right? And we simulate the impact of certain policy and we just looked at a new steady state. But as you said, the world is evolving and, productivity slowdown in advanced economies has been very pronounced. The demographics are very adverse, they will really undermine growth going forward. On the other hand, we do see China slowing down quite a bit as well. Maybe it's just a temporary phenomenon. But you're right, there's been a big, there are big global trends that need to be taken that need to be taken into account. And I do have to admit that the analysis that we presented so far is not taking these into account.
Okay, thank you very much, Petia, and I think it's a great start to the day. Thanks.